I think the key for me in moving out of the crisis is to build stronger and build forwards. So look at the learning that you've had, look at what you've experienced, look at what it tells you, look at how you need to change and develop. Don't just try and go back to the way things were, because you're going to miss massive opportunities to really improve life or really make a difference.
In this episode, I speak to Amanda Coleman. Amanda was head of communications for Greater Manchester Police for many years, resigning in 2019. She's a chartered PR practitioner and a fellow of both Chartered Institute of Public Relations and Public Relations and Communications Association. She was a finalist of the Online Influence Awards in 2020 and a top 10 blogger as seen by Vulio. She's also the author of a book titled Crisis Communications, which was released in 2020. So you're really into horses, right?
Well, I've got a horse. I've had my horse for 19 years, so he's an old man now. Got a few health issues at the minute that we're trying to manage. But yeah, so I do love, they're lovely animals, really, really lovely animals.
And what got you into them in the first place?
But do you know what? I think I got to, it's really weird. I hadn't particularly had anything to do with horses. I got to my mid-20s and thought, I really want to learn to ride. So I started learning to ride in my 20s, and then just got hooked, really, I suppose. And it was a matter of time then before, at some point, I knew I would always have my own horse to look after. And yeah, so that happened in 2003. So we've been together a long time. Longer than a lot of marriages. So okay, I always say.
That's a while, yeah, longer than a lot of marriages. That's cool. So what kind of riding do you do?
I used to do dressage. I used to do dressage competitions, not particularly high level, but because my horse is 18.2 hands high, so that makes him about one of the biggest horses you're likely to meet. And I'm not one of the tallest people you're likely to meet, so we're not particularly matched. So I used to do dressage, and I did a bit of dressage judging. I still do a little bit of dressage judging. I got kind of sucked into all that world that people always take the mickey out of, which is dressage.
Where are you from originally?
Well, I've been born and brought up in Atherton, which is just in Wigan, not far from Manchester, and spent I spent most of my time there. Lived in Sheffield for a year, but my parents, interestingly, I'm not actually from northern stock, as my other half likes to tell me. My mum and dad were born and brought up in Gloucestershire, and then moved up when they were in their early 20s, and never moved back. They moved into Manchester, and then after a couple of years moved outside of Manchester to where they are now. So I was actually, sadly, I was going to tell you very boring stories. I was born in the house that my mum and dad still live in.
That's really lovely. So tell me about a time when you first decided or realised that communications was the thing for you.
Wow, that goes really far back, because I was at primary school, and one of my teachers actually on when I was leaving, and they used to write things in a little book for you. She wrote, "I'm looking forward to reading your first article in the Manchester Evening News," which was weird. And that was, yeah. So I think it goes that far back. No, none of my family have ever been journalists. None of my family have ever been kind of involved in anything to do with anything like this. But yeah, as far back as that was when words, I suppose, were my thing. And then literally I was the most annoying person at secondary school when I used to go to the careers teacher, and they'd go, "Well, what is it you want to do?" And I said, "Oh, I want to be a journalist." And they'd go, "Well, what's your backup if that, because it's very competitive, very difficult to get into?" And I go, "I haven't got one. I'm going to do it." So so that was always my focus, and as it was, that was what I did for 5-6 years after doing my degree and graduating, and then doing postgraduate in journalism. I then worked on local newspapers, all part of the Manchester Evening News group, interestingly enough. So so in and around the northwest. And that was where but yeah, it goes right back, I think.
So when did you realise that journalism wasn't for you and you wanted to move into a different type of working with words?
I don't think there was any one point where I went, "Oh, do you know, this isn't quite what I thought I was going to get out of it." I remember being uncomfortable with. I would go for interviews at more national focused agencies and things, and I was never going to do some of the things that they may have wanted me to do. My ethical standards, I think, were quite high. So, if they,
Sorry to interrupt, but what kind of things?
yeah, I mean, things like how far would you go to get a story in a nutshell? And I would not go to the point of, undermining people or causing problems. I mean, I was quite strong on that. I used to always find doorstepping, going knocking on people's doors when they'd had a bereavement in a horrible way. I used to find that very, very difficult. As it was, whenever you spoke to them, they were lovely, and then I could feel as though I was doing something positive. But I did used to struggle with some of those elements. So I think over a period of time, I kind of thought, I don't feel I'm quite getting everything that I wanted from it. I still love newspapers, and I still, I'm obsessive about the news. But yes, that's when I looked at public relations then to see, I suppose, what that could offer and what that might bring.
And what did you find in public relations?
My first move into PR was working for the Environment Agency, which was interesting. At that point, it wasn't. Now it's more like a umbrella under the umbrella of the government. At that point, it was a bit more distant, but they did such a wide variety of things. And I think for me, I could see the benefit you could have to people. So when we were doing things around, prosecution, I used to do a lot of prosecution press releases, when they would prosecute for various environmental problems, then I could feel I was doing something really positive. And I think and you start to see the options and how do you get creative, and it's a different element really of the kind of communication world than I've been used to, and I quite enjoyed it.
And how did that morph then into joining the police force, which you were at for 21 years?
No, well, just happened to see a job advert for a press officer and thought, well, I'd always quite liked doing the crime related work. Found it quite interesting, court cases and that kind of thing. I was a journalist. I thought that sounds like it could be a bit of both, really, a bit of the journalism kind of buzz that you used to get, but also using your kind of PR skills. And luckily I got the job, and then it just became an obsession, I think, because you're so much in the front line. It's so fast paced, there's so much going on. I worked in two metropolitan forces, busy forces, lots of stuff happening, really at the heart of the stories and things that are going on in the world. And not only that, you can see how communication could have a direct benefit to people and how it could really help, by effectively supporting them, helping to catch offenders, just a whole range of things. So before I knew it, I'd spent 21 years there.
You just mentioned that you saw how it could help people. What was your first experience of the job opening your eyes to that?
Yeah, I remember it quite clearly, really, because it was a New Year's Day, and this is going right back, this is going to before the year 2000. That must have been way back. And they'd been a murder, and it was really, nasty, really horrible. And I remember going to speak to the deceased person's wife and talking to them about what we could do and how we could, what we could do with the media and how things would work. And, you start to be able to then really see when somebody's having the worst moment in their life, potentially, how you can offer that little bit of support that might just help them a little bit, to kind of deal with what's happening around them. And there was another occasion not long after that where a young boy had been murdered, and I was speaking to the boy's mother, and I can remember it as if I was there again now, 20 odd years on, because you offer such kind of support around how to navigate a way through. The media want to speak to them. How can you kind of help them so that they can get from it what they want to? And that's always was kind of the focus, is what what do they want to get from speaking to the media? You know, you don't want them to feel as though they're going to be the people that perhaps I felt years ago I was exploiting by knocking on the door, but that they can get their story out and say what they want to, and have their loved one remembered in the way that they want to. So yeah, for me, that was when you really started to see what you could do with the job you had.
So really quite early on in your time with the police and helping them with their communication, you came across one of what is your key tenets now, which is how communications affect other people. Can you talk to that a little bit?
I don't think I probably realized it at that point. I kind of just felt it was the right thing to do, and it felt as though we were being a support. And but the big turning point was with the Manchester Arena terrorist attack, and I remember the aftermath of that. Really, the only thing from the comms team we were focused on predominantly was how we were helping people. What could we do to help the families, the victims? What could we do? How could we do that a little bit more? And yes, you know, the police investigation was important, but the primary focus was always on the, you know, how could we help the people caught up in that? And that very much is just now, I suppose it's my kind of passion to make sure that communications professionals recognize the important role that they play and the good that they can do if they just perhaps sometimes look at things from a slightly different perspective. I always say it's like looking at something that's happened from the outside in rather than the inside out. You know, look at how it's affecting people and what they're feeling and what they're seeing, rather than getting caught up in the bubble of the organization that you're working in. Because you know that if you do that, you're going to cut off so many really vital bits of information and things that you need to do. So really try and focus on people first, the organization or the business second.
So that's really interesting, because I mentioned to you previously that I coached sport for a long time. And one of the things that fascinated me in the sports world, or coaching sport, was how to get my athletes to do what I wanted them to do by communication. Because in my sport of rowing, my only tool when my athletes were on the water is my voice, because I'm dissociated from them by distance. I'm in a different boat to them. They are often not looking at me, and I have no means of demonstrating. I'm in a motorboat, they're in a rowing boat. So it was really interesting to get them to try to look at things in a different way by using my voice and the words that I said to them. It's really difficult to do because it's an implicit skill. How do you communicate something that is implicit? But that's something you're also describing with as one of your passions, is trying to get people who are communicating to look at things differently, which is probably quite implicit because they're trying to pattern match, and oftentimes you can't give them the instructions and the words to look at things differently. So how do you communicate that?
It's a difficult thing, but then I also think it's incredibly simple, because it just needs you to take a look at what you're doing, and almost if you're writing something, think about if you were the person at the center of this problem, at the center of this crisis. If you had suffered because you've lost a loved one, what were you likely to feel? How would you feel seeing that word or that phrase, or seeing the organization do something in that way? And I think when you start to look at it that way, it's incredibly simple. And the more you can do to put yourself in the conversation with other people, to listen to what other people are saying, to gather the mood and tone, the better position you're going to be put in. So it is a challenge at first, but I think the more you do try and put yourself in that position and look at things that you do all the time in a slightly different way, then the better, the more proficient you'll be at it when you are in the middle of a crisis and you really do need to do it and do it effectively.
That's interesting, because you're talking about a feeling, almost like a bodily feeling. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday, in fact, where somebody was explaining about coming up with ideas and having an insight into a certain scenario. And he described that as being a visceral bodily event. And oftentimes, because we want to be productive people, or a lot about humanity nowadays is to be productive, we often completely discount our feelings, and they're pushed to the back. And we're kind of stoic in a cultural sense, not in philosophical sense. You're obviously saying that it's really important that we should be experiencing these different ways of communicating in a bodily sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, particularly looked at it, I suppose, that way, but we're not automatons, are we? And I say to people, if crisis communication particularly was simple, then we'd have artificial intelligence giving us all the right answers all the time. But it's not, because it's about so many variable factors. It's about so many different things. So really, if anything, over the last 2 years with COVID, if we take anything positive out of what we've all been through, it's recognizing that what we need now is empathy and humanity, and it's right to be human, and it's not a problem anymore. So if something's happening, I was listening to some of the translations around one of the Ukrainian translators, and he was getting obviously upset, even though he carried on doing the job and he was doing the translation, and but obviously upset. That's fine. I think more of that person than if they were stoically trying to just get through it in a kind of really professional way. I don't think they're any less professional. So I think there's a bit about, if you've got an emotional situation, then you can't be a machine. And if you are a machine, then you're not going to be giving you your best. So it's not about being over emotional. I'm not expecting people to fall apart, but it's about recognizing you can say, this is affecting me, and show a little bit of that, because it makes you human. And I think the more, particularly people in authority positions, are seen to be human, the more kind of confidence and trust you get in them, because you can see them as a real person rather than a name, an entity, a kind of job title.
Do you have any tips for people on how to be more human when they're trying to communicate stuff?
It's not easy to say, well, if you do this, then you'll be human, because what you've got to have alongside that humanity is authenticity. So you can't pretend to be bothered. And people can see it, can't they? But there's a lack of authenticity. Yeah. It's obvious, really obvious. So I don't think there's necessarily a kind of key tip, but I would just say it's just about connecting and recognizing and almost affirming. Yeah, if you do feel upset about something, that's fine. If it's particularly from, say, a policing perspective, you're dealing with very emotional situation, then you're allowed to look as though it's an emotional, challenging, difficult, horrible situation. You can still look professional. You can still look like you're dealing with it properly. But I think if you don't, and there's an archetypal police officer that everybody always says, it stands there, I was proceeding in an orderly direction, blah, 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 and you're doing that, then you've lost it. You've lost the support, because people just don't warm to it. They don't see the genuine, nature of it. And, the whole point is to try and engage with people and be, so that you will hopefully be able to explain what's happened, get people to come forward with information if that's what's needed, or provide some kind of support if there's something else that's needed in that sort of place.
Okay, let's go back to sort of the history of your experience now in the police force. Tell me about a time when you really struggled with your job as the head of communications or one of the police departments that you worked for. I'd like to put to one side a moment the 2011 Manchester bombing, because I'd like to talk about that more as we go on, but maybe another example.
There was lots of times, really. I've had lots of occasions where I've had massive disagreements with senior police officers over what should or shouldn't be done in a set of circumstances.
Okay, so tell me about one of those times.
Oh, well, I'm trying to think, because there were so many. Not that I was a disagreeable person.
I'll believe you. Thousands wouldn't.
I I always thought that was my job. You know, you've got somebody with professional experience in communication, and you expect them to give your views. I mean, one of the times I won't go into the background of what happened, because it's still something that sort of rumbles. But I remember the chief constable at the time going to me, I've got to go I've got to go and refute X, Y, and Z has happened. I've got to go and sort out blah blah blah. I want to be on the radio, and literally the incident that the police had been involved in was a few hours earlier. So there was lots of things we didn't know, and I was no, for lots of reasons, and you start explaining why it's not appropriate to do that now. We need to learn exactly what's gone on, find out the information. And he actually walked off, walked out on me. To be fair to him, he did come back and apologise for walking away. But you know, they're really challenging, because you kind of go, did I do something then that I shouldn't have done? And you kind of go replay the conversation. I've had a lot of time over the years where you replay conversations to just check, you know, was I sensible? Did I do everything I should have said? But yeah, but hopefully you got to the right place in the end.
How did you get back to the right place in the end?
Well, I stood my ground and was prepared was prepared in case, you know, it was like, well, I'm going to do it anyway. So I was trying to do contingency planning in case that happened, because I knew it would end badly. But as it was, you know, they walked away and reflected on it and came back and went, no, I think you were probably right, a few hours later. But you've got to have a kind of inner strength sometimes with those sorts of situations, because you can easily start to doubt yourself and doubt your advice. You know, was my advice right? And that's well, you know, you've got to sort of get that inner strength to go, no, I'm sticking by what I think is the right course of action at this point in time. But it's quite hard sometimes.
So do you think there's a difference between communicating as the face of an entity, a corporate entity, or a civic entity, and communicating with people in a team?
Yes and no. I'm going to say I'm sitting on the fence, aren't I? I think there are elements that are similar, because communication is communication, I suppose. So there's that core element that will always be similar, no matter what it is and what you're doing. But then you've obviously got some very distinct differences. You know, if you're working in a business and you've got shareholders and you've got, you know, financial regulations to think, that's going to take a focus for you. From emergency services side, obviously, or public sector, you've got the issue that you're a publicly funded body, and got all the things that go along with that. So I think there's those elements that then take it into a slightly different focus and a slightly different realm.
Okay, let's switch it up again and ask you when you really realized that specifically crisis communications was something that was of great interest to you, rather than just standard external communications or corporate communications. Like, clearly you were in an environment where, the police doesn't tend to get in the news for good things. They're always in the news for something negative. So when was it that you really decided that crisis communications was something that floated your boat?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's always been, for the 21 years that I was in the police, it's always been sort of there, because you do deal with a lot of serious incidents and serious situations and full on crises. But I think in terms of making it a real focus for me and really wanting to I suppose step it up into making it my sole focus, probably a year after the arena, when I'd started to process what had happened, and reflect on life, I suppose, and which sounds like a kind of weird, but it's like a lot of things, and a lot of people probably felt during COVID, when you've been through a crisis situation that's really affected you. You sort of do a bit of a stock take of your life and look at where you are and look at perhaps where you want to be, and are you happy with how things are? And the more we realize the kind of fragility of life, the more I think that sometimes pushes you to have that sort of analysis of what your life looks like at that point in time.
So let's dive a little bit into that incident in your life, which was obviously very key. How did it unfold to start off with?
Yeah, I mean, the 22nd of May, 2017 is a day it will always be with me in the way that, it's affected more severely affected many people, and the heart of that are the 22 the families of the 22 victims. I think sometimes things are so huge that you don't ever go back to the way things were before. And I say this a lot when I'm talking to people now, but you deal with a situation that is life changing in lots of ways for lots of people. What happened was, I mean, I'd had a normal Monday at work, relatively straightforward. I'd come home, was just getting ready to go to bed when our press officer who was on call, who was a kind of duty cover that night, contacted me and said, there's been an explosion at the arena. And I suppose you get that kind of feeling, even at that point when we didn't quite know what it was, that this could be something quite serious. We'd planned and trained and looked at the response to a terrorist incident. We kind of knew from a communications perspective what we would do and how we would respond and how it would look. We'd had conversations with other public services, and then very quickly it was obvious it was something quite serious. And so I then headed into work after, I'd gone into work at 7 o'clock that morning, come home for a little bit and got ready to go to bed. I got out, got ready for work, went straight back in, and sort of ended up working, I think, for about 36 hours without going home. I didn't see my partner because I ended up working nights for the next few nights. I didn't see my partner for 4 days and was trying to sleep when I could within the day. It was a very, very busy time. And even now, I suppose sometimes I have to really think hard, what happened on what day? Because it all became this kind of just busy period of time. And it was quite difficult to remember what sequence things happened in. But yeah, as soon as we went in and as I was en route, I got word that it was going to be at some point, it has to go through the process, but it was fairly likely to be declared a terrorist incident, and what we were facing. Then you just go into what you've learned. So you go into your, right, this is what we need to do. We need to make sure all these things are in place. And that's, kind of what you do in the start point, because we plan for it. You switch into, just dealing with what you're faced with.
And what were the things that you needed to put in place?
It was making sure that I had enough staff for that night, making sure that everybody wants to come and help. You always see this when things are happening, and particularly, if it comes to everybody wants to help. No, I need you to go home and go to sleep because you're needed tomorrow, because this is going to be something that goes on for quite a period of time. As it was probably a month before anything else had been looked at, thought of, beyond being in connection with the incident within the team. So you've got to protect and try and have enough people to get you through that first few days. Very much focused on, for me, because of the time it happened at 10:30 at night, realizing that there'd be a lot of people that would have gone to bed and would be waking up in the morning to learn about what happened, and would be really concerned potentially about friends and relatives. So to make sure that during that night we put out as much information as we could, so that whoever was switching on the news at whatever point would have a really good understanding of what had happened, and more importantly, where to go if they were concerned, where to go if they needed to try and get some help because they weren't sure where somebody was. And that remained our kind of primary focus throughout the night, was to just keep trying to make sure that we could give the latest information, the most accurate updates, and make sure that people had somewhere to go, so that they could phone and say, look, I'm concerned because I haven't seen X, Y, or Z person.
And God forbid anybody listening to this has to go through the same type of scenario as that. What did you learn from that situation?
One of the keys for me is, what I've said all the way through everything, is focus on the people. So even on that night we were looking at, right, how can we help people with this? How can we help the people who may not know where their friends or relatives are? And that's the thing we did right the way through. Every statement, every bit of information that we put out, that was the focus at first before anything else. So I would suggest, my advice would be, make that your focus of your efforts, and everything else will follow, will follow from that. But also recognize the toll it's going to take on you and the team who are responding, and try and get additional support if you can. It's not always that easy, but you very quickly, if you're trying to run a press office, a kind of response, comms response for 24 hours, you very quickly run out of enough people. And I think I would have recognized now that I should have asked for more help quicker than I did, because people were getting to really exhausted before we'd managed to get extra resources in. But also they were exhausted emotionally as well as kind of physically from the long hours that they were doing. And again, one of the key bits is, people often say, well, comms isn't frontline, but you will know more details about that set of circumstances. You will know information that you can't ever not know. So it's about making sure there's a package of support to help people deal with what they've had to go through, and make sure that they can come through it as best they can.
And can you give me a specific example of how you did help people with the communications that you were doing in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we really wanted to do was make sure that we could put out all the tributes from families of the bereaved, and that's quite difficult because there's a very specific process in what they call disaster victim identification. So you need to get agreements with the coroner about what you can say and how you can do it. But I had a press officer who went to each of the families of the victims and spent time working out what is it they wanted to put out, and what was the photograph that they wanted. And for me, that's a massive direct kind of benefit you can see. And that support went right through with the funerals, so that we tried to work with the media and families and the police family liaison officers who were really amazing, to make sure that if people wanted the media kept a distance, and they wanted it more private, that we could try and negotiate, make sure that happened. And we worked with police communication colleagues, because there were funerals all over the country, to make sure that happened, and that was dealt with in the best way we possibly could. So, I mean, those are two really kind of tangible sort of benefits, I suppose, from keeping that focus.
Yeah, and thanks very much for sharing some stuff that you think you could have done better with that. I think that's really helpful for people listening to this. A while ago, you said that nothing was the same after that incident happened, as far as you were concerned, or police force was concerned, or how you communicated what was going on. You've just written a blog article fairly recently about the importance of not going back to normal following COVID from a communications perspective. What do you mean by that? What was normal? And how have things changed?
I think it's just a phrase that often gets used. We'll get through the crisis and then we'll get back to normal. And there are some crises that happen that are so significant, life will change for a lot of people. I think every crisis, the life, people right caught up in the middle of it, their life's going to change, because a lot of people lose loved ones. So they have fundamentally had a life-changing experience. But if you think back to 9/11, the airline travel massively, never been the same since, has it? Airline travel suddenly changed overnight because of what happened. And for the people caught up and around Manchester, what happened on the 22nd of May 2017 will always be with the city. It will always be with the people who were there, because you live with it, but it's part of you. It's part of what you've experienced. And with COVID, I think we've all experienced it. Some people have suffered more than others, but it has fundamentally changed so many aspects of our lives. The thoughts that I still go out wearing a mask. Now, you would never have thought that people would just get used to wearing face masks, even when they're not told to wear them, or that working from home is now flexible working is acceptable in a way that it probably would have been another 10-15 years. There's lots of aspects of it that have changed. I think the key for me in moving out of the crisis is to build stronger and build forwards. So look at the learning that you've had, look at what you've experienced, look at what it tells you, look at how you need to change and develop. Don't just try and go back to the way things were, because you're going to miss massive opportunities to to really improve life or really make a difference. And I think even with the arena, which there isn't a lot kind of that you can say positive about that, but the work that Fegan Murray's doing to get Martin's Law introduced, which would fundamentally change how security is done at events, that's going to potentially be a real significant achievement, something positive building forwards out of something that was so horrendous. So yeah, that's why I think if you keep saying about going back to normal, it potentially means you're going to miss opportunities. You're not going to recognize how you can develop, and you can potentially just end up back in the same position in a few years when something else happens and you haven't learned anything from what you've been through.
So how do you spot those opportunities though?
I think they're obviously there. If you review what you've done during that situation, if you, from a communications perspective, if you've done evaluation, if you know what worked and what didn't, if you can see the benefits that have come to the organization through the approach that you've taken, then that you will see them. It's almost like the crisis communication elements morphs into a sort of change comms world, really, as you move out of the crisis. Or for me, that's where it should do. And then it's about kind of pushing those things forward. But it should come from all the work you've done in debriefing and reviewing and looking at that situation that you've been through.
In that case, you're really saying that the message should change from bouncing back from incidents that threaten a reputation potentially to changing how or envisaging a new future that is much better than what you've just gone through.
Yeah, I hate the phrase "we're going to learn the lessons" because it gets so overused, it means nothing. But actually, it's about learning from your experience. And we all know this. We should do it on a daily basis. Remember it from as when you're kids. If you put your hand in a fire and it burns, then you take it out. You don't do it again. So there's a bit of taking that sort of experience of looking at what you've been through, looking at what you think worked, looking at what needed to change, and making some changes out of it. And for me, if you had a crisis communications plan that was in operation for your organization in February 2020, if it isn't fundamentally different now, then I think you have missed opportunities because the world's different, because the way we communicate is different, because the technology we've got available is different. So it is very much that, don't lose that experience you've been through and what you've potentially learned along the way.
Okay, thanks for exploring that. I'd like to switch to something which is hopefully more of a positive experience that you had in a positive event that we can talk about. I found a video on YouTube where you were giving a presentation or a speech on the social media strategy you had at Greater Manchester Police, where you moved from broadcast to engagement. Can you tell me, first give me the cliff notes about, what happened there, but then explain to me why you needed or you found the need to go from broadcasting information to engagement with the community?
Yeah, okay. This was back in 2010, and social media was sort of in its starting to emerge, but not really, well, nowhere near where it is now, so many years later. And what we were always wanting to do from a police comms team perspective was look at how we could connect the police with communities, how you could break down barriers, how could you fundamentally what we needed was the trust and confidence between public and the police, so that if people had information, they would feel comfortable coming forward and talking to the police about it. And if and if they needed help, they would also come forward. So that was the fundamental within everything that we did. So what social media seemed like a massive opportunity to connect very directly with communities, or with a section of communities anyway. So what we wanted to do was test out the kind of approach of giving frontline officers, neighbourhood officers working in areas, their own Twitter accounts, as it was to start with, to see what level of engagement and almost see what they could do with it. It was like giving them the freedom to go, okay, you see how it's going to help you operationally, and we'll work it from there. And it worked really, really well. I remember the very first it was actually a police community support officer that we had, who had social media, had Twitter account, and we used to call him Tweety Ben. Ben, he was
But he
lovely.
loved that.
Yeah, he did actually. But he was great. He used to do little reports on, this is what I've done with it, and we could start to see how, at one point it was a student area, and there was a rape that happened, and he was putting out messages saying, like, if you need me to come and talk to you, let me know, direct message me, I'll come and speak to you, and and kind of fellow students, I'll be at these locations at these times if you want to come and talk. It's brilliant, direct, and really, really kind of give him a real local information updates and access in a way that we haven't been able to do before. It'd be very formal notes in the local newspaper saying, this officer will be doing our surgery at this place at this time. But this was much more kind of fluid, and we had to fight against the language, because obviously he was using normal language, and sometimes that grated with senior officers who felt it was a little bit perhaps not what they wanted to see, but actually it wasn't about them, and we had to keep saying, it's not about you, this is about, in the first case, this is about students, particularly in the student area, younger people, professional people, and and it's got to be something that they want to connect with. So that's the way it started, and over a period of then of a sort of just short of a year, we rolled it out to every area. So we put some checks and balances in place. We had to kind of manage some of those risks. We trained them, but we were training them in the use of technology. But actually, that was the biggest issue. Being able to communicate effectively is a totally different thing. A lot of this was just around, this is how the technology works, and here's some kind of parameters to work within. But you could see the massive benefit, and what we got very quickly from that, instead of just going, here's a lot of information that we're pushing to you, was a conversation that started, and that's what we tried to then replicate on the formal sort of Greater Manchester Police social media, so that it would be a bit more relaxed and it would encourage people to ask questions. And we tried to do things that would show behind the scenes, and we'd do like Twitter chats and so web chats and that kind of thing, and just take it into a different arena. So yeah, it was transformational, really. And the fascinating thing was to see the way some of the cultural elements within the organization changed as this started to kind of change, and some real positive elements that came out of it in doing that.
There are plenty of organizations who are still not using social media to have conversations with people. They're just broadcasting information. So I can imagine people listening to this going, fine, I know that I need to start having conversations on social media, but my boss is not allowing me to do that. He just wants to broadcast stuff about the business. So how did you persuade your managers, leaders, bosses, however you call them, that this was the right thing to do?
Yeah, it was the chief officer's team. Well, the thing for us was we had done some social listening. We'd done some work to analyze where people were talking about the police. We kind of looked at the landscape, and we tried to see the opportunities. So we then outlined a kind of proposal, which was that we would have one account, which became Tweety Ben, one account which would then allow us to test it out. We had a whole flowchart risk management plan, because that was the biggest thing, and that's the thing I stressed with a lot of things, is the more you can show that you've understood the risks, that you're trying to mitigate them, that you're alive to them, you start giving that level of protection then to those senior people who are going, oh, I'm not sure this is going to work well for us, and how will we deal with all these problems that are in their head when they talk about it. And so we put a whole kind of proposal together with the kind of policy around it, and then we presented it to them and said, this is how we want it to work, this is what it would look like, this is the checks and balances, we will keep monitoring, we will do the training, etc. And they agreed it. And I think sometimes they agreed it because they didn't quite realize what they were agreeing to, so they thought, but no, I think they had the foresight enough to say, it was something worth testing. Had we done one account and realized it wasn't going to work, or there were too many problems, or we couldn't manage it, then obviously you've got somewhere to go with it. So it was a dipping the toe in the water first, but actually it was surprising how quickly it spiraled, and that was because people could see what the benefits of it could be. So, you know, more and more officers were going, can we be next? Can we have an account next? Can we sort this out next? Can we do that? So, you know, then once that real operational benefits came through, we can feed that back to those bosses and say, you know, this is the sort of thing that they're able to do. This is how it's having a big impact. And, you know, and that makes it a business tool. It's no longer a kind of comms tool, it's a business tool. And I think that elevates the conversation to a different level.
So you're putting the business plan to the people above you and they sign it off. But again, I can hear somebody listening to this thinking to themselves, okay, fine, I've got sign off, but how do I actually start conversations with people through Twitter, especially something for the police? Because, you know, as I've said, a lot of stuff on the media is very negative about the police, and I hesitate to say mistrustful, but you know, there's a barrier between law enforcement and the general public in a lot of circumstances. So how do you then show that human element of something which previously there has been a barrier between them and the general public?
Well, you picked on the right thing. It's being human. It's all about being human. And the more you can just be a normal person. So it was like, you know, hi, I'm Ben, the PCSO for whatever. Not I'm PSO 51234. Do you know what I mean? The more you make them, they are real people. But regardless of what people think about the police, they are real people wearing uniforms. That's all. But they are still people underneath that. So what we tried to do was make sure that all the people that were engaged in doing this felt comfortable, and we supported them and would protect them to a certain extent when some of the bosses didn't like things that they did. That they were real people having real communication and real conversations, and it was about them making it meaningful. So it had to be meaningful to the local area. Now, I had an 80-20 rule. 80% of what they did would be absolutely fine. 20% there would be an issue with. It's just the nature of the beast. And provided in that 20%, it wasn't something that was deliberately trying to cause a problem, that was deliberately trying to upset people or whatever else, then I'm fine with that, because you've got to test. The difficulty, I think now, bear in mind this was 12 years ago, the difficulty I think you've got now is that so many people are on social that you can't necessarily test the water in the way that we did back in 2010. It's just not that sort of it's much more sophisticated now. It's moved on so much more. People's acceptance of problems or failings or of not quite hit the right tone is so much less than it was at that point. We were given a lot of leeway, I think, because everybody was in their infancy, really, of using social at that time. But really, it's about making it meaningful and giving people the ability to be themselves, even if they're wearing a uniform or even if they've got a certain title and work for a specific organization.
Right now, we are unfortunately in a time of war where Russia has invaded Ukraine. And you wrote a blog article about the fact that the Ukrainian president is communicating in a way which does not improve his image. He's simply doing what is right by staying in the capital. And whereas Liz Truss and Boris Johnson are both communicating right now to improve their image, Truss by standing in front of the Ukrainian flag, and Johnson, who is said to be at the front line talking with troops. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it came out of a conversation on social media where, you know, people are obviously talking about President Zelensky's approach and how great he is at communications and blah, blah, blah. And for me, that's not the point. This is about people's lives first and foremost. So I am quite sure that he's not sitting there going, do you know what? I'm going to go out and look as though I'm sat with the troops. I'm going to go out and put on a flak jacket. I'm going to, you know, he's doing it because that is what he needs to do, because he needs to be seen in those areas, because he wants to be with the troops, because he wants to be talking to people. And, you know, it's not about his image. Now, as it is, that is exactly what people want to see. That's exactly what people, what Ukrainians want to see. They want to know that he's there with them, that he's leading from the front, and that he's sorting things out. massively contrasted that was happening at the same time as two photographs came out that really kind of hit home for me. The one you said, which was Liz Truss stood in, if anybody remembers the New Statesman comedy program from many years ago, stood like that, in front of the flags. It's trying to show support, but it's so staged. It almost feels false, because there's no authenticity in there. It's very much here's me showing what I need to show in front of flags. And the same, Boris Johnson was out talking to troops, but he's not in the front line. Don't say that he's in the front line. The front line is 2 hours away in Ukraine. So no, for me, that's the contrast. And what I want to see are leaders who, first and foremost, are right. These are the things I need to do in this set of circumstances, and the communication enhances and builds on that, but it isn't the driving factor. And I think that was just the thing for me. I think in many years from now, somebody will probably, there'll be lots of very academic studies of Zelensky's approach and what he's done and this, that, and that's probably fine in 10, 15, 20 years from now. At the minute, with the horrific situation and everything that's going on, what matters is that he does what's right, and the communication, that isn't the driving force.
Yeah, I really liked the blog post. So thanks very much for writing that. I thought it was fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about the book that you've written. What motivated you to do that?
Yeah. Again, it was the turning point for me of dealing with the arena and recognizing when we came kind of out of that situation, that everything that we planned and prepared for and all the careful systems and policies and things that were put in place had forgotten one thing, and that was the people who were affected. So that, it talked a lot about police investigations and how we support the terrorism investigation, and it didn't talk about the victims' families and what we do with that. And that was where our focus was. So it was obvious for me that actually we're missing a massive trick, I suppose, or missing a massive element of crisis comms, in that we're planning and developing processes and putting structures in place and having governance frameworks. But if they're not actually focused in the right way on supporting the people who have been caught up in this crisis, then they're never going to be as effective as they should be. So that was where it sort of started for me, and that's what drove me to want to really look at that from start to finish. So the book goes from planning for a potential crisis right the way through to recovery, and that for me is important, because we often get to a point where we go, right, the crisis is finished, let's go on to the next thing. And there's a bit where, if you're going to be really effective, you manage from crisis communication to recovery communication, and then on into sort of change and whatever else needs to happen. And that bit of the move from a crisis to trying to recover is the bit we don't often talk about. So that's why I wanted to put a big focus on that, and also make sure that the people element, it's supporting staff, looking at well-being, working with stakeholders, to make sure all that was covered in some detail.
So can you pull out a few elements that you highlight in the book about the recovery stage of crisis communications?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is making sure you're at the right point to say you're in recovery, rather than just sort of lurch towards it or say too soon. There's sometimes organizations, and we've seen it a lot over the last 2 years with COVID, where we're going, oh, but it's over by Easter. Oh, it's over by Christmas. No. I've got in the book, there are 7 questions I say you need to work through to give you an indication of whether you were at that point of moving from crisis to recovery. And I won't bore you with all 7, but the fundamental one that underpins all of them, which is my 7th, is what's the public mood and tone. Because operationally and organisationally, you may be ready to move forwards to recovery, but if the public mood and tone around it isn't, then you will appear callous, heartless, and you'll undo lots of potentially positive things that have happened if you move forward too fast.
So going back to that 7th point of the 7 that you highlighted from the recovery after the crisis, it's all very well for a government or an enormous organization like a police force to be able to figure out what the public sentiment is after a crisis, but how does that happen for a smaller organization?
Yeah, it's one word that I would say with it that's the critical bit, and that's listening. if you listen to people. So you don't need to be a big organization. You just need to be listening to people, and whether that's, what's been said to your frontline staff, whether that's what staff are saying about it, whether that's what stakeholders or shareholders are saying about it, whether that's what's been said on social media. Listen to what people are saying. The more you listen, the more you're going to have a feel for where people are with what's happened.
And before we wrap up, I would like to ask you about resilience and mental health, because clearly you're a real advocate of that for industry and communicators in general. So can you speak a little bit to that?
I mean, life's difficult, life's challenging more now perhaps than at any point for a long period of time. People's resilience is often low, and the more we put on ourselves without recognizing the support we might need, the more potential you've got there for a problem. And it's not just potentially dealing with one big incident or one big crisis or one big problem. You can have a number of smaller things, smaller incidents, smaller problems to deal with, and they just build up over a short period of time and can push you to that point of I can't cope with things. So the key bit for me is to talk about it so that people are more comfortable explaining their own experiences. And I think that there's a lot within the communication industry at the minute where people are talking more openly about the problems that they've had and how they've tried to overcome it, and how they deal with it. So I think that's really, really important. I think it's gives people the opportunity then of saying I need help, and I think the more we can do to kind of get rid of any stigmas around that, the better, because we need that support mechanism around us. We need to know when we're at capacity and when we can, and how we can step away and then kind of regroup and kind of build ourselves back. And sometimes things take a period of time. I suppose it was probably 3 years, 4 years, 3.5 years, go on that, before I actually dealt with some of the issues I was carrying from the arena. So it can take quite a period of time, and that's that's the same for lots of people. The key is that you acknowledge how you feel and get the help that you need.
I read a book during the lockdown of 2020, the first one, but this was a book written by somebody who helps people in the military and law enforcement services in the United States, predominantly, I would have thought. And he was talking about PTSD and the fact that PTSD has become a thing after the fact that nighttime no longer was a factor in warfare. So before the First World War, when night fell, generally fighting would stop, other than maybe a few skirmishes or whatever, but fighting would generally stop. Everyone would put down their weapons, go back to their camp or their respective sides, all sit around a campfire, and were able to tell stories about the great deeds they'd done during that day and the heroics of the people they'd lost. And that gave them a way of talking about the horrific incidents they'd been through and being able to deal with it. When the First World War came about, that went away. People were bombing each other 24/7. And so our ability during warfare and horrific incidents to actually stop, put everything away, sit around a campfire, or sit around and kind of talk to people about things seems to have disappeared.
I think I've not heard that kind of theory on things, but I do think the fast pace of life and the demands of modern life and how we're all attached to, I mean, and I'm one of the worst. I have the telly on 24/7 on the news. I'll be constantly, when something's going on, watching it. And that doesn't give you the time to process what's happened, and it doesn't give you the time to go and talk to people. I also think we've got this kind of approach where you don't necessarily want to admit it, certainly within certain workplaces, that you're struggling, because it'll be seen as a sign of weakness, or you feel it'll be seen as a sign of weakness. So you're then hiding potentially how you feel. So yeah, I think there's a number of factors, but the way we're all connected and can see things happening, in an instant, I think does make it a real challenge to be able to process everything that goes on around us.
Lastly, I'd like to ask you about the consultancy you started in 2020. How's that been going for you, and what plans do you have for the future?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I interestingly started this consultancy on the 23rd of March, 2020, which, if anybody remembers, was lockdown day. So that was really good. So I have to say, it was 3, 4 months of, oh my God, what am I going to do? The world had turned upside down. Things that I thought were going to happen were no longer going to happen. I used to speak to people who've been doing consultancy work and freelance work and running their own businesses and say, is this normal? Am I, is it ever going to change? Whatever. So I weathered that as best I could. And then, yeah, so where am I at now? Coming up for nearly 2 years now. And it's brilliant. I'm loving it. Getting to work with lots of different organizations and businesses, exploring how they can improve their crisis preparedness, helping them when they're in the middle of something and they need some kind of support and advice. And I'm really, really enjoying it. So what comes next? Well, I'm hopefully not giving anything away, but I am in the process of completing a second book, which hopefully will, all things, hopefully be out at the end of this year.
That's quick.
It's not. I've been
Okay.
for a little bit, but that's been tough trying to balance writing a book and working at the same time, full time, the new business, build business. But anyway, so hopefully all kind of linked to the same sort of subject area. So yeah, onwards and upwards. That's where I feel, and still trying to keep focused on what I'm really passionate about when I'm doing that. So, that's what matters to me is really making a difference, and improving things for businesses and for people as much as possible.
Great. Well, I wish you all the best for success in the rest of this year and in the future.
Thanks very much.